Congressman Allred, thank you so much for joining us. You are running to unseat Ted Cruz in the 2024 election. Congressman, it has been decades since a Democrat won statewide in Texas. Why do you believe your campaign is the one to end that streak?
Well, I think we know as Texans that we can't afford 6 more years of Ted Cruz. We know who Ted Cruz is. He's somebody who is always looking out for himself. He's somebody who we can't count on in a crisis. What I think this election is going to be about is who are we as Texans? Because the truth is we don't have to be embarrassed by our senator. We can get a new one. And I have a record of running in tough races and telling what I think is a unique story about growing up in this state, understanding who we are, being raised by a single mother, going to public school, making it to Baylor, making it to the NFL, becoming a civil rights lawyer, and ultimately being in Congress. And I believe that in this election, we're going to reject the divisiveness of Ted Cruz.
Congressman, when you launched your campaign, you really emphasized the idea of bipartisanship. Now, we both know Texas is the epicenter of some of the most divisive issues in the country, whether it is immigration, firearms, you name it. What are you telling voters to bridge those divides and bring people together into your campaign?
Well, I think there's a hunger out there among Texans for somebody who will come along and talk about the things that we share instead of spending so much time on the issues that divide us. And listen, there are big differences in some cases, but by and large, when I talk to Texans, and in the Texas that I grew up in as a fourth-generation Texan, someone whose family came from Brownsville, who's lived in Dallas, lived in Waco, I just believe that our state has so much to offer if we can get out of our own way. And in many ways, Ted Cruz has been kind of the avatar of that. He's somebody who has pitted us against each other his entire time in the United States Senate. He's somebody who spends most of his time demagoguing on his podcast or on cable news. He doesn't actually do much legislation to help Texans. And I think there's a hunger to reject that. I've shown in my time in Congress, there's another way. You can act in a way that brings people together, that has the biggest business groups like the Chamber of Commerce endorsing me, as well as the biggest labor unions like the AFL-CIO, that I can win awards for my bipartisanship, deliver for our veterans, deliver for our economy. It is possible.
And you've been on what you call a listening tour throughout the state. You were just in El Paso this week. You said you were headed to San Antonio later. When you're listening to these voters, Congressman, what are they telling you?
Our listening tour is off to a great start, and I was incredibly proud to go to El Paso to start off our listening tour there and to accept the endorsement of my dear friend Veronica Escobar and State Senator Cesar Blanco. And what I'm seeing is that Texans are hungry for change. They recognize that our state has, as I said, so much potential, but that Ted Cruz doesn't represent who we are. But they're wondering whether or not we can do anything about it. And that's what I think we have to prove to folks over the course of this election, is that we don't have to be stuck with the senator who we know isn't doing the job, that we can actually get a new one, and that we don't have to be embarrassed by our senator. We can elect somebody who will work for us. And that's what I've been hearing, and I'm looking forward to going all around the state. So everybody keep an eye out, as we'll probably be coming to somewhere near you.
Now, of course, Congressman, before you face off against Ted Cruz, you will have to get through a Democratic primary. We know there is another name in the race. San Antonio area State Senator Roland Gutierrez is also running for the Democratic nomination to run against Ted Cruz. When you look at the policy positions from you and Senator Gutierrez, there's not a whole lot of daylight that I see. How are you differentiating yourself and trying to convince Texas Democrats that you are the right name to take on Ted Cruz?
Well, I'm laser focused on defeating Ted Cruz because that's what ultimately this is about. And I think Texas Democrats also have to make that same determination. Who is better placed to defeat Ted Cruz? I've shown by the way that I got into Congress and the tough races that I've run, beating a 22-year incumbent here in Dallas, Republican, who had been unopposed in the previous election, having a tough re-election in 2020. I know how to run in tough races. And we've already shown, I think, in the launching of our campaign, the kind of resources and effort that we can bring to bear. So that's what this is going to be about, is who is better placed to beat Ted Cruz. But it's also true that I have a record of accomplishments at the federal level in Congress that we're going to talk about and contrast with what Ted Cruz has done. And that's something I think is going to be very important for the general election.
Congressman, let's get into some policy specifics now. We know the eyes of the nation are on Texas right now, specifically on the Rio Grande on our southern border. You tweeted just a couple days ago that we need to avoid the rhetoric that Ted Cruz is using when describing the border and use, quote, common sense solutions to find common ground in an immigration policy. What does common sense border policy look like to you? What does that mean?
Well, I just was in El Paso visiting with our Border Patrol and going to the border and hearing about some of the issues that are going on there. And listen, I just reject this idea that we either have to act in an inhumane way or go against our values in a way that I think is inconsistent with who we are as Texans and Americans. That the idea that that's the only way for us to have border security, that's just not true. Border security is made up of many different things, and we do need more personnel at the border, but we also need to allow those personnel to do their job and not be spending all their time, processing claims. And so we have to have a comprehensive reform that addresses all of the needs of our economy through our immigration system that also secures our border. What we've seen from Senator Cruz is that he wants to use this as a political issue. He wants to go down to the border and treat it kind of like a political safari, like he's just there, pointing out migrants in the bushes. You're a United States Senator. Where's your legislation to help deal with this problem? We actually know that we have a framework that we know will work. We've seen that in the Obama administration and the Bush administration frameworks around comprehensive reforms that have passed. Veronica Escobar has put forward a bill that I am a co-sponsor of that I think is also a very good bipartisan framework to try and get something done. Both sides will have to give a little bit in terms of getting this done, but I think Texans and our economy demand that we get it done.
Firearms, Congressman, are also bound to be a huge issue in this race, not just from Ted Cruz, but of course your primary opponent has made that a sticking point of his political career, especially after the tragedies that we've seen in Texas recently. If you are a United States Senator, what kind of firearm regulations or policy will you advocate for in the Senate?
Well, I have a record already in the United States Congress of advocating for what I think are common sense measures to try and reduce gun violence consistent with protecting the Second Amendment. We, I think, as Texans have a long tradition of responsible gun ownership. I grew up, driving down to Brownsville where my grandmother lived, seeing folks with, shotguns in the back of their truck. We understand how to be responsible around firearms, but that also means that there have to be some limitations in terms of how do we keep it out of the hands of folks who shouldn't have it. The universal background checks is something that we have to get done. We've made some step forward in terms of in the last Congress with the Safer Communities Act that Senator Cornyn helped push in the Senate and that I helped push in the House. And we did, for the first time in 30 years, have some legislation to reduce gun violence. But this is another case where it's just not true, this kind of political narrative that we either can have nothing in place at all to do anything about all of our hallmarks of our communities potentially becoming the site of the next mass shooting, or that we are going to do something that's inconsistent with the Second Amendment. There is another way, and we know what it is, and most Texans and most Americans support it.
Last question from you, Congressman. I want to get an idea of what the next year or so looks like for you. When we look back at the last 5 or so years in Texas, that was the last time a Democrat got within striking distance of Senator Cruz with a unprecedented campaign by Beto O'Rourke that brought in record fundraising. And he employed this style of campaigning that hit all 254 counties in Texas and talked to voters one-on-one. When you look back at the Democratic performance in 2018, do you take from that lessons to emulate or mistakes to avoid? What kind of strategy are you going to employ to bring Democrats across the finish line in 24?
We're going to build on what Beto did in 2018. And I think the excitement that he generated, the fact that he showed that so many Texans do want to move on from Ted Cruz is incredibly important. But this is also 6 years later. It's a different race. It's a different time in our state and in our country. And I'm a different candidate. And I know what it takes to win in tough races. And I know what it takes to get folks who maybe usually don't vote to turn out, but also how to help folks who maybe don't see themselves reflected in this version of the Republican Party have a home where they can go. Because Ted Cruz is the extremist in this race. Ted Cruz is one of the most extreme senators in the United States Senate. He's one of the most divisive senators in the United States Senate. He's somebody who we know we can't count on in a crisis, like when we had our statewide freeze and he jetted off to Cancun. We have to make sure that Republicans who aren't comfortable with that kind of a candidate also have somebody that they can vote for, and that independents have somebody that they can vote for it. And that's the kind of campaign that I've always tried to build. One that brings folks together around our shared values, around who we are as Texans, around who we are as Americans, that appeals to those better angels. That's what we're going to do over the next year.
All right, Congressman Allred, we really appreciate your time. We'll see you out there on the campaign trail.
Okay, thanks so much.